Hi everyone. In this demo, I'm going to show you the seam finish stitch in pink. So here I have two panels of fabric sewn together. If I flip it around, you can see the seam allowance. This is the right side with all the lines, and this is obviously the wrong side that has the seam allowance. To make this demo a little easier to see, I created a seam allowance of 1 inch. Okay, but you can do this on 3/4 of an inch, half-inch seam allowance. I just thought it'd be easier for everybody to see it if it was on 1 inch seam allowance. Okay, so let's talk about this real quick. Seam finishes are a way to clean finish the edge of your seam allowance. So if you're not going to line your garment, or even if you are going to line your garment and you have a fabric that frays a lot, this is a good way to finish that raw edge. So you can see I'm kind of pulling on it, and I can pull out some of these fibers or some of the strands that this fabric was woven with. Okay, so stitch in pink is basically where we take a pair of pinking shears. So that's what this is, pinking shears. It's the scissors that have kind of that triangular edge to them, and you simply cut along the edge of the seam allowance. And what this does, it cuts those triangles into the seam allowance, and those triangles are on bias rather than straight grain or cross grain or whatever you ended up cutting your fabric on. And those angled cuts, those triangle cuts, are on bias, and bias doesn't fray, so it'll keep that edge of your seam allowance from fraying. Okay, so what you can do is you can go ahead and just eye it and cut the edge of your seam allowance. I like to actually stay stitch the edge of my seam allowance, which gives me a nice line to cut along, so I get a much easier even cut on the edge of my seam allowance. So let's go to the sewing machine and let's stay stitch the edges of our seam allowance first. Okay, we're here by the machine. The first thing I want to do is isolate one of my seam allowance. So I'm going to take one side of my seam allowance. So I'm just going to take this side, for example, and I moved everything over to the other side. Okay, so all I have is this one seam allowance that I can stay stitch. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to stay stitch this at 1/4 of an inch. All right, so let's go ahead and stay stitch each of our seam allowances at 1/4 of an inch. One. Let's trim these threads off real quick. Like so. All right. Now let's go ahead and do the other side. Again, isolate that seam allowance, so all you have is just the seam allowance there and nothing else. And we'll stay stitch that at 1/4 of an inch as well. And there we are. Open this up. And now you can see I've stay stitched both seam allowances at 1/4 of an inch from the cut edge. All right, so let's go ahead back to the cutting table and we'll go ahead and pink that. All right, we're back at the cutting table. I'm going to go ahead and pink the raw edge of each of these seam allowances. Again, I like to isolate one of the seam allowances so everything's out of the way so I don't end up pinking part of the garment or something. And I'm just going to use that stay stitching as a guide to cut along. And that gives me a nicer, cleaner edge. And you can see as I'm cutting how it cuts those triangular shapes that then will not fray, giving you a clean finish on the inside of your seam allowance. Do the other side as well. And there we go. I've now clean finished my seam allowance by doing the stitch in pink. And you can see I've stay stitched it, and then I just pinked right across that, or right along that stay stitching. Okay. All right, that's one way you can clean finish the inside of your seam allowance.